Hello and welcome to the seminar with Professor Luigi Caranti on his recently published book, Kant's Political Legacy, Human Rights, Peace, Progress. The book has been published by University of Wales Press in 2017. We should start with Luigi's brief introduction to his book, and then with commentaries and replies. Yep. Okay, Luigi, thank you very much for coming, and please, you have a word.
All right, thank you very much for hosting me. I'd like to thank my colleague and friend Bojan for organizing this symposium, and also the other colleagues that made this possible. It is truly a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss with you my recent work, about which I'm going to say something extremely brief. I'm sure that you will challenge me on many of the different points that I try to develop. Well, for those who are not familiar with the book, it's divided in three parts. One is devoted to human rights, and in particular, I try to develop what I think is a Kantian account of the foundation of human rights. Kant seldom uses the expression Menschenrecht, and often in the singular. He doesn't speak about human rights in the plural, but rights of men, or the law of man in a certain sense, which is ultimately natural law. And still, I think he has something to say about innate rights that are, to a certain extent, similar, certainly relevant from a philosophical perspective, at least, for the foundation of human rights. So what I do in this first part, and in particular in the first chapter, is to analyze a passage in the Metaphysics of Morals in which Kant says famously that we have only one innate right, and that right is the right to freedom. By freedom, in that context, Kant means external freedom, in the sense of, having a right to a sphere of freedom that ends when the sphere of freedom of other citizens begins. Actually, he talks about this right as an innate right, so supposedly we have this right also in the state of nature. So it's a right that pertains to human beings as such, not to citizens, already within an established institutional setting. What is interesting about that passage is the reason why Kant thinks that we have this innate right to freedom. He merely says that we have it in virtue of our humanity. Now, of course, if you want to understand this account, you have to understand what is in the concept of humanity that supposedly grounds the fact that we have this right to external freedom. I try to show that what has to be there is not merely a notion of, humanity is a technical notion in Kant, and is unfortunately not very consistently defined in the writings of Kant. Sometimes it refers, humanity means the ability to set ends for ourselves, which is a sort of neutral capacity of, being able to direct ourselves without external interference. And other times, by humanity, Kant seems to mean something weightier, something thicker, which is not just the ability to set certain ends, but also the ability to do that in full independence of sensuous stimuli, inclinations, and so on and so forth, which Kant's clause actually is identical with the notion of autonomy. In Kant, as you know, autonomy means the ability to act from duty, to perform moral actions, and I think that you need to understand humanity as autonomy if you want to make sense of the idea that the sheer capacity for moral behavior, the sheer capacity for acting from duty is going to give you any rights, and in particular this right to external freedom that Kant claims we have even before the constitution of the state. Other things are interesting in that passage, including the fact that Kant seems to be suggesting that we can derive analytically from the innate right to external freedom other sub-rights, including, most importantly, I would say, a right to equality. So the picture you get there is that of entitlement that human beings have qua human beings to a sphere of freedom that is equal to that of everyone else. And since the only reason for that justifies a limitation of freedom is the protection of the freedom of other individuals, these spheres of freedom have not to be simply equal with one another, but also most extended. So that's what I do in the first chapter, and then I try to compare this account that I read in Kant with foundational accounts that you find in today's literature. I distinguish three main orientations. I call it instrumental, orthodox, and political. And I show that they have serious shortcomings. All of them have serious shortcomings, and even when they get closer to the spirit, at least, of the account that I read in Kant, like in the orthodox case with the orthodox orientation, I think that there is a serious gap in that account of human rights. There is a serious shortcoming even in the orthodox orientation about the foundation of human rights, because the orthodox will tell you that we have human rights, as Kant says, in virtue of our humanity somehow, that we have it because we have human dignity and so on and so forth, but he willingly avoids any account of the reasons why we have this human dignity, or what grounds human dignity, which in turn is supposed to ground human rights. I think that Kant cuts deeper. He tries at least to gives us an explanation. We may like it, not like it, doesn't matter, but at least he has an account to explain why we are worthy creatures with dignity, and for that reason that we are entitled to what today call human rights. The second part of the book is about peace. It is the outcome of a long and perhaps too long research project that I've been carrying out in the last 5-10 years, I should say. And its main purpose is that of distinguishing between Kant's model for reaching perpetual peace, which I still find quite appealing and solid, distinguish that model from a model that claims to be just an update of Kant's model, that the model of the democratic peace, that is the idea that democracies don't fight each other, why that is the case, and so on and so forth. And I basically try to do two main things after giving an historical introduction of how the Kantian model for peace develops from the early writings, idea, throughout the metaphysics of morals. After doing that, I try to show, on the one hand, that the two models are different, which I call it the hermeneutical point, and I show why these two models are different. And on the other hand, I try to show that from a purely normative point of view, and by normative I mean what the philosophers mean by normative here. That is, what we have good grounds to wish what is grounded from a conceptual point of view. I try to show that the Kantian model is superior to the model of the democratic peace. The third part of the book is about progress. It's probably the most speculative part of my entire book, the most difficult in the sense of perhaps being just the weakest part of my book. I take a challenge here that is considerable in the sense that I try to defend mainly a reading of Kant's famous idea that there is a guarantee of perpetual peace, or his idea that there are reasons to believe that the human affairs are bound to progress towards peace, towards the cosmopolitan constitution, are bound to progress towards a better world, if you want to put it this way. I try to take these arguments seriously, and this is seldom the case. I mean, people try to downplay as much as possible these arguments because they found it dogmatic, because they found it too speculative, they found it naively optimistic for many reasons. I try to give at least the best argument we can develop out of these materials that Kant proposes. I try to defend the guarantee of the thesis of the guarantee of perpetual peace from three major charges, three major criticisms that you find in the literature, and about which perhaps we'll say something in the discussion. Perhaps I should say, to conclude this introduction, that in a sense the main motivation behind this book has been that of finding in Kant, as it has always happened in history in a certain sense, sort of guidance in a period in which our major reference point seemed to be questioned, criticized. What I find appealing about Kant's political legacy is precisely that he gives us a model for orienting political action that can make sense of many different parts of our initiatives. It seems to me that today's politics, especially in the West, one of the most interesting features is that it no longer has very clear where it should go. So the main goals, the kind of direction that we want to take, and the different steps that we want to make in order to reach that end goal. No matter how you may criticize Kant for many things he has said or not said, I think that at least he gives us a fairly clear model of what we should do and where our political efforts should lead us. And so I try to use Kant hermeneutics as a way of defending a certain view of political affairs, and especially of the directions that political affairs should take. So that's pretty much the book.
Okay, thank you, Luigi, very much for the excellent introduction to your book. So we shall now start with commentaries and your replies, and at some point we shall have a short coffee break. So Olga, would you like first to start, because you're gonna leave us a little bit later? Okay.
Yeah, I asked to start first because unfortunately I have to go. Okay, so
could you please first introduce yourself in one or two sentences, so that we could have a conversation among friends and not among strangers.
Okay, my name is Olga Nikolic. I am a research trainee here at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, and I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of Philosophy here in Belgrade. My main field of research is phenomenology, social and political philosophy, and philosophy of science. So I'm trying to connect all these fields together in some way, like cognitive science and phenomenology, for example. On the one hand, on the other hand, theories of collective actions that we're doing here at the Institute, and so on. Okay, so my question will be about the concept of dignity, and actually about the connection of this concept of human dignity with social justice. Well, in your book you derive human dignity from Kant's concept of autonomy, from our moral capacity to overcome our sensuous inclinations and act from duty. And you also argue that how exactly the list of human rights will look like will depend on the context, cultural and other social factors, conditions that determine what it means to have dignity, to live a dignified life. And what I'm actually interested in is precisely this question of how respect for human dignity could be realized in practice. And I think certain social justice policies are necessary for this. Why this is especially interesting for me is because Igor and me, Igor is right here, we wrote a paper together not long ago on social justice, and we actually tried to find a normative foundation for social justice policies. And we also singled out dignity as this, and respect for human life and dignity. That's how we formulated, that was our formulation, as a normative foundation for the policies of social justice. And by policies of social justice, I mean primarily those policies aiming at greater equality of members of a society and for protection of the most vulnerable members. So it was this principle of respect for dignity, but we tied this with the difference between factual and formal freedom. So for us, freedom, this concept of negative freedom, or freedom from infringement, freedom not to be interfered with, was merely formal, and we tried to develop this concept of factual freedom as concrete, real, actual possibilities to act in a certain way. And we actually argued that in many cases this makes a difference between living a dignified life and not living a dignified life. For example, if I'm poor and live in a society where education is expensive and education at the same time allows access to certain jobs that are in turn allowing me to live a decent life, to have a decent paid jobs, right? Then if I'm poor, I can't have access to. So I can't have access to decent life. I can't live a dignified life. So that was our argument basically, and we argued that this mere formal principle of freedom will not protect dignity. Is not sufficient to protect human dignity. And another argument that we also found that was inspired by Kant, actually it was Igor found it in Kant, is that social justice could also be justified by the legal obligation of the state to protect civic dignity of all members of society. And you actually mentioned this, it is connected to the distinction between active and passive citizens, which you also mention, and you mention that Kant actually at one point says that certain economically dependent
women and
yes, and economically dependent actors should not be allowed to vote. But our argument was that in Kant, some places actually there are some places where that could be interpreted as so that he actually could argue for protection of everybody's right to active citizenship, basically. So, which would mean that everybody should have certain economic independence guaranteed in order to be able to be active citizens, in order to preserve civic society. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this were some elements that I was interested. What would you think? How would this fit with your theory, with your idea of dignity and grounding?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Luigi.
So I reply one by one. Yeah.
I
think it's better. Yes. Okay. Well, one of the problems of my account is that once you focus on human dignity, then you have the problem to bridge the notion of human dignity with the list of human rights as we know them, that treat many different areas. They protect civic and political freedoms, but they also protect social and economic rights. They protect a right to participate in your government. They protect a right to free holiday with pay. They protect many things, many specific things, quite specific things. And the problem for me is to make a bridge between this notion of human dignity, assuming that is well grounded on autonomy, which is itself a problem, but let's assume that that's the case. Another problem that I have is how to translate human dignity into, this kind of specific rights. So I have to show that unless you don't have the right to participate in the decision of your government, then your dignity is endangered, is violated. I have to show that unless you are given basic education, then your dignity is violated. I have to show that I have to argue, I have to check whether in the case in which you are not given free holidays with pay, then your dignity is in danger, and so on and so forth. So this criticism is usually raised by people who belong to the instrumentalist orientation. Remember, the instrumentalist orientation says we have a straightforward way of justifying human rights, justifying the normativity of human rights, because all we have to do is look at human needs. We look at what humans need in order to have either a good or a decent life. We protect these needs by attaching a right to the object of these needs, and we have the list of human rights. So instrumentalists are in a better position compared to my approach, because by referencing to human needs, they already have a list specified or fairly specified that then can be translated into human rights. I don't, because I have a monistic theory, if you want, in which everything depends on the fact that we are worthy creatures. This entitles us to some rights, but which specific rights is a question that I have no answer for. Now, is it impossible to provide an answer from my perspective to this question of the bridge? Well, I don't think so, although in the book I don't even try to make the effort to build this bridge, if you want. What I am most interested in is, let me put it this way. I'm not at all opposed to the notion of looking at human needs in order to create this bridge between human dignity and human rights. I don't think you can actually build this bridge unless you introduce some reference to what humans need in general. But what I am most interested in is to distinguish between two questions that, in my opinion, are at two very different levels of the discussion. The question I developed in the book is the question whether we are entitled to anything just in virtue of the fact that we are the creatures that we are. And I think that there is an answer to this question in my book. I am less interested in the question of how in each specific society you translate this attitude of respect toward human beings into specific social policies that protect the dignity that we have all agreed we have. I'm not saying that it's not an important question. I'm saying that from a foundational point of view, which is the perspective I am most interested in, the first question, the question that I try to answer, is the question. So, if you want to do a foundation of human rights, you have to show me not what we need, but what we have right to, or whether we have right to in general. So that's the philosophical question I'm most interested in. I think this approach is compatible with working at a lower level of abstraction in which you, again, trying to translate this notion of human dignity into specific social policies. But I'm afraid I cannot say much on this second question because I consciously focused on a different one. Now, I don't want to avoid your question, though. I mean, no, I'm trying to take it seriously because I understand that in your paper you presented, you are trying to say, basically, we need social justice, and I take by social justice, you mean thick welfare provisions, redistribution, not too much economic inequality.
Well, yes.
Right?
Again, it's sort of, it could be interpreted depending on the context, translated differently, the principle of social justice.
Yeah.
So it's still abstract.
Yeah, of course it's abstract.
It's connected, and the point was that it is that there is maybe even a necessary connection between protection of dignity and certain commitment to social justice.
Oh, I think that is certainly the case. I mean, take Rawls' theory of justice, most influential theory of social justice, as you call it, that we still have nowadays. Rawls makes no reference to human dignity in his entire philosophical project. He starts from certain basic ideas that we already find in a certain public culture, liberal democratic public cultures. We are all free and equal. We take ourselves as free and equal. What can we infer from these two main ideas of freedom and equality among citizens of liberal democracies? And you get the two principles of justice, basically. So no reference to human dignity whatsoever. The approach that you seem to be taking is different. You say, well, I mean, most social justice provisions, concrete provisions, cannot be accounted unless you don't read them through the lenses of human dignity. So, I don't understand whether you are doing that as a reconstruction of how social justice policies are justified to the eye of the public opinion, or whether you want to make a philosophical argument in which you say, no, we need to refer to human dignity in order to justify this social.
Philosophical argument.
Okay. It looks like that you are working on the second question that I distinguished, and I'm most interested in your work, obviously, in this case. I think the closest thing that you find in the literature, maybe you want to look at that, is Jeremy Waldron's account of human dignity, because what he does basically is the following. He says, Well, he puts in the way of saying that human dignity should not be conceived as a value, but as a status. I mean, leaving aside terminology, his idea is basically that we need to understand the relation between human rights and human dignity as a sort of dialectical, fruitful dialectics between two different poles. You start from the human rights that we already have, so you look at the international treaties, you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are the human rights that we have. You make an analysis, sort of almost from the point of view of a legal scholar. In fact, he is a legal scholar. And you realize that there is one fundamental idea behind all the human rights that we have, and that's human dignity. Once you have done this, you try to see, you go back to the list of human rights that we have, and you see whether all of them square nicely with this notion of human dignity. So, for example, you might want to say that even if you are not given free holiday with pay, famous Article 11, I think, of the Universal Declaration, your dignity is not put in danger. I mean, if you are not given the right to exercise your religion, then this is more serious. Okay, so it's a dialectic, because it's not the case that, like in my approach, you start from a well-defined definition of human dignity, so we are autonomous, therefore we are worthy creatures, therefore social policies have to take this feature into consideration. But he works internally. So it starts from the human rights as they are, it derives from this an organizing idea that is human dignity, and then he goes back to human rights, trying to see whether all of them fit well with this organizing idea. In the book, the only thing I say to this effect, I mean, that goes in the direction of what you were asking, is that it is perfectly okay from a normative point of view that each society, to a certain extent, decides to implement this notion of human dignity in a different way. I mean, within limits, obviously. What are these limits? Well, the limits are the limits that have already been established in the culture of human rights. So, genocide, slavery, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, all this stuff is things that is clearly against human dignity, and there is no discussion about that. Below these indisputable violations, there are other things that are left to each society to decide. I mean, is it a violation of human dignity not to have provision against people who lose their job in the period from one job to another? I would say yes, it is a problem, that there should be a social policy to that effect. Is that a violation of human rights if there is no such policy? That is a little bit more difficult to defend, right? But again, I don't think this is a job that a philosopher should do. It's a job that a political community should do, in a certain sense. Not the list of human rights, but how you translate these human rights into specific social provisions.
Yes, because we have two kinds of human rights: philosophical human rights and international lawyers' human rights.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
So we are speaking today about philosophical and about philosophical foundation of human rights. Okay, thank you, Luigi. Thank you. Do you want to? You have a question or what?
A question on this.
Okay, please.
Okay, but I think the Kant argument is strongest and philosophical, not on social justice, how we conceive it today in strict sense, but actually about that everyone has the right to find his way up from passive to active citizen. And because what are the arguments for taxation? Arguments for taxation is that actually it has to be done for state preservance. And
it has to be done for?
State preservance.
Yeah.
and but not in a material existential extent that it will become ended, and using some arguments from, for example, Susan Melchel and similar authors, but because the general society, civic society, function as general will which united themselves in society, and if state cannot afford citizens to become active citizens, then society, which is general will united in a society, becomes corrupted because there are no actually citizens who are law-giving.
Yeah.
But we have corrupt society. And in that way, I think it's philosophical argument. Kant actually doesn't speak on this factual freedom of citizens in a way of dignity, in the same way as it's ethic, but it is actually argument that explains something that we call today in theory, for example, in Josiah Ober's political dignity or civic dignity, that we have conditions to take part in political life. Because if we don't have, and if citizens don't have rights to take part in political life and public decision making, then civic society became corrupted. And I think it is stronger and actually philosophical argument about constitution of the state and in fact why we have to introduce some of social justice policies.
No, I agree. If I just
please,
quickly.
please.
Okay, yeah, I love your attempt to defend Kant out of his notion of passive citizenship. I myself try to suggest that there is a smart, I would say, way of looking at the notion of passive citizens, not as a datum in Kant. I mean, to take Kant as someone who takes passive citizenship not as an empirical fact, but as a problem. So that was what I think that Olga was suggesting, something along these lines. So as long as people are in this condition of dependence, it is perhaps right that they do not have the right to vote. But this is a problem for reasons that have to do with the general will. I like very much that suggestion that, you know, if the general will is the ultimate normative authority, and if that's supposed to be general, it means that everybody should be at least in principle capable of participating in the law-giving. I mean, it depends how you interpret the general will, because the general will could be also the will of someone who is very enlightened, and so there is no necessity that everybody participates in this process. I mean, if you read it in an objective way, the general will could be done by specialists. I mean, those who read what the general good is for a specific society, those should be the lawgivers, basically. Yeah. So it really depends. But I like the orientation. I mean, you don't want to force Kant's text too much because he says many things against social policies. I mean,
I think against the argument that social policies could be introduced related to the needs. But I think this argument is totally different and argue for another kind of...
I mean, the only argument in favor of taxation of the rich that I find in Kant is that the state has certain obligations against orphans, against people who cannot provide for themselves. That's not exactly the same as the second principle of justice in Rawls, right? It's not like the same, you know. You make more money simply because if you made less money than what you make, then the poor would be worse off than in the condition under consideration. I mean, you don't want to make Kant as, you know, a social democrat, because basically he's not.
Read the quote that you actually found in Kant's lectures on ethics.
Mm-hmm.
That is more radical than usual, than this interpretation about organizations that should provide for the poor and that sort of thing. So he says, one can participate in the general injustice even if one does no injustice according to the civil laws and institutions. Now, if one shows beneficence to a wretch, then one has not given him anything gratuitously, but has given him only what one had earlier held to take from him through the general injustice. But if no one took more of the goods of life than another, then there would be no rich and no poor.
Sorry, say the last sentence again, please.
But if no one took more of the goods of life than another, then there would be no rich and no poor. Accordingly, even acts of generosity are acts of duty and indebtedness which arise from the rights of others.
Right. Well, no, I didn't know this passage. Thank you. The only question would be when he talks about, I think what he's describing in this passage is the following. You are benefiting from an unjust social scheme, you make a lot of money, and then you give something to the poor. By giving something to the poor as an act of generosity, you think that you make up for the original injustice, and he's criticizing this kind of mentality. Now, what makes unjust the original social scheme is the question. Because sometimes he suggests that as long as we live in a republic, therefore we are all considered as equal citizens and we have more or less the same formal opportunities to reach positions of power, to make money, to improve our condition and so on and so forth, then even the outmost inequalities are compatible with justice. That's a passage from, I think, Theory and Practice. So that looks like a libertarian scheme. As long as the condition in which everyone's freedom is guaranteed and no one is benefiting from a larger sphere of freedom than other people, then what happens down there in the consequences of the economic distribution is not a question for justice.
So you do think that Kant could foundation human dignity only on innate right to freedom. He's
right.
A Republican, yes, and that's a formal procedure. He's doing that formal procedures, yeah.
That's a criticism I already had. How can you think that Kant is a good foundation for human rights if he's not so much a friend of social economic rights?
Yeah.
That would be a way of putting it. Well, I think that I am entitled to pick and choose here, pick and choose in Kant. What I think it's promising is general view of human beings as intrinsically worthy creatures for the reasons that I explain in the book. Then there is Kant, who talks about social justice. Then there is the Rechtslehre, and what he says, for example, about the fact that, just to take the craziest thing, he says that children who are born outside of the marriage, they should not have the same rights as children were, or
like people in Africa. His lecture on geography.
Well, racism is also an issue. Pauline Kleingel did a great job to show that this racism decreases as he grows older and gets wiser. I'm just trying to say there is Kant who gives us a general view of human beings. And I think that's very helpful if you want to make a convincing foundation of human rights, which incidentally is not as parochial as many people think. That is, it's not something that is okay just for us Westerners. It's not okay for other cultures and religions. And there is a Kant who talks about a specific organization of the society, and perhaps there is an inconsistency there. But it's an inconsistency within Kant. I would say it's not so much a problem for me.
But there is also third Kant, but I will speak about it later. Okay, so Alexander Fatic has a comment.
Just 2 comments.
Oh yes, of course, please.
I love what you just said about Kant's quote, which Olga had brought up. And I always, reading Brian Barry, for example, the socialist accounts of social justice, I could never sort of resist this temptation to consider Brian Barry a Kantian. Because, Kant failed to emphasize the importance of social and economic rights, but it seems to me that he basically compensated for that by his overemphasis on equality, of the intrinsic value of equality. And in much of the social accounts of social justice, you also have this argument which insists on equality. Brian Berry says that about taxation. He says we should overcome the psychological barrier in Western societies where taxation shouldn't go over 40% because it violates our sense of justice that we give more than half of what we make to the state. Why? Because there is an intrinsic assumption that what's really valuable, morally valuable in social interactions is equality. And having become rich in a particular society, I presumably managed to do that by systemically or specifically infringing on certain equalities which other people had to give up in order for me to be in an advantageous position. So there's the echo of this argument, I think, in socialist accounts of social rights as well. Now, that's my first comment. And a question, sort of, does that ring a bell with you in any way? And the second comment is really a query on the boundaries of plausibility, the limits of plausibility of Kant's rejection of a human needs-based account of human rights, specifically relating to the arguments put forward by Jeremy Waldron and Iris Marion Young and others. There's this famous debate between Waldron and Young about the rights of homeless people. You remember that probably. When the issue is really whether a homeless person, a veteran in Los Angeles, has a human right to urinate in public. Now, it seems trivial, right? But, this person has nowhere to cater to his basic physiological needs. He's homeless. He lives in the street. But by urinating in the public, he violates a sense of public order and perhaps violates the aesthetic and social expectations by others. So in Los Angeles, if they do this, they get taken in by the police. Now, why is this challenging for a Kantian view of human rights and dignity? Well, homeless people are probably the closest people to those having the most extremely limited autonomy in society. If you think about autonomy in a sense of being able to have more or less autonomy, not just as a border concept, as an absolute concept. I am autonomous because I can set ends for myself. But there's also something intuitive about me being able to be more or less autonomous, depending on the range of choices which I have and the range of actual abilities to set ends for myself. Because animals can also set ends for themselves. They can't do it autonomously, but they can still set ends for themselves. Now, of all the people in Los Angeles, the homeless people are probably the least autonomous. Now, do they have human rights?
Oh, so it's a criticism for linking human rights to human dignity. Yeah. Okay, I see. Let me start from this last one. Okay, I think one of the few virtues of my account is that I do not make the mistake that Griffin makes, for example, in linking human rights to something that comes in degrees, like purposive agency, for example. So, if I did, then I would be in the troubles you suggested, that I would be saying that the least, you say, autonomous people in the society, precisely because they are so little autonomous, they have fewer human rights than the other people who have better autonomy. So, I am aware of the problem. I think I never made this, of the many mistakes I made, I never made this one. Because I think, I suggest that we have human rights because we are autonomous, and this characteristic does not come in degree within the human species. So the homeless person in Los Angeles is entitled to exactly the same human rights as the richest billionaire who lives in, I don't know where, in Hollywood or Beverly Hills and whatever. Because what you call autonomous, I would say external freedom. I mean, external freedom comes in degrees and depends on social structures. That is certainly the case, that the homeless is the least externally free person in the citizenship of Los Angeles. And precisely for this reason, his human rights are violated, I would say. So you don't want to conflate autonomy with external freedom, because in my account, and in Kant's, I think, autonomy is the ground of external freedom. This one does not come in degree. The thing that autonomy grounds comes in degrees, and depending on whether we are given an equal sphere of external freedoms, our human rights are respected or not. Now, here comes back the question of social justice. I mean, a libertarian Kantian could tell you, well, you know, as long as this homeless person is not considered a kind of B-class citizen, or, you know, his freedom is not restricted a priori because he's considered a pariah or something like that, he's not given the right to vote, he's not given, you know, the kind of civic and political freedoms, then no problem with the record of human rights of this guy. But in this, you know, in this sense, again, I think that once you have established the fact that human beings are worthy creatures, if you buy into my argument that if you take seriously the notion of autonomy, you can get to the idea that human beings have human rights, then at a different level of investigation, you can ask yourself what you need in a society for making sure that the dignity of each individual is not put at risk. This is a political question. I'm not saying that you have to solve it by voting, but I'm saying that it's not a question that is at the same philosophical level of the one that I try to answer. And I don't think that starting from human dignity makes your life more difficult than it should be, than if you start from a different approach. I think that there is still work to do. I'm not sure it's just a philosophical work that needs to be done. I suspect that it's also a political work, in the sense that each society has to decide how to protect human dignity. But I don't think that the two questions have to be conflated with one another. So that was the second question you made. The first one, equality, in the first question you were more sympathetic to Kant, I think, because you were, you know, kind of picking up on the suggestion. I mean, that passage is interesting because I hear Rousseau there. When the last sentence, that's why I asked to repeat it, the last sentence, if we were in a truly just system, then it would not even happen that people have more or less. Now, taken by itself is a little bit extreme as a sentence, right? People are different. I mean, even if we live in a very just society, differences in outcomes will happen, and it's not the case that we will end up fortuitously with the same amount of money regardless. But the question is, I hear Rousseau there because I think Kant sometimes has the intuition that if the society is plagued with extreme economic inequalities, then we have a problem. I mean, some inequality is fine, but too much inequality becomes a problem even for the civic and political freedoms. He never makes this argument explicit, but, you know, that passage. I was just reacting to the fact that it doesn't matter how much he emphasizes equality, it's very hard to read in Kant equality in material sense. So it's true. I mean, I think he makes the argument in that passage I focus on that you can derive analytically from an innate right to external freedom, an innate right to equality. But it would be very hard to take equality in the sense of either equal material resources or even not to unequal distribution of material resources. It's truly a formal criterion there.
Okay, thank you, Luigi. Who wants next? You? Sally, you?
Can I?
You want next? Okay,
thank you.
Could you please make a brief introduction and one to the basis of your current research and your position?
Okay. First, I would like to thank to my friend Luigi for coming to Belgrade and for giving us a chance to talk about his book, to criticize it, to exchange our views with him. And then I must say that I'm truly grateful to Rasko for at least two reasons. The first reason is that he organized this seminar and that he managed to invite such a distinguished participants. And the second reason is that he has given me the chance to talk about Luigi's book and also to write an article on it in the journal that he's editing. I'm professor of political sciences. I'm associate professor at the Faculty of Political Sciences here in Belgrade, and what I deal with is mainly political theory and history of political ideas. So, for example, I look at the problems the European Union of today is facing from the perspective of history of political ideas. That's what I do. So I'm not a philosopher, and
Even better.
no, that's why I like to really profit from this situation and to present you my main arguments about Luigi's book and to hear your criticism. I would like to see what Rasko, Luigi, and all of you think about it. So I will read you something that I prepared for this seminar, and that later I'm going to transform into that article for the book. So, will we ever learn to handle the apparent contingency of existence? The question seems to have troubled philosophers ever since it emerged. The philosophical predicament arises from the assumption, hope or faith, if you will, that there must be more to man than there appears to be. Something within to break the fetters of banal empirical existence and propel him to the true divine heights. The transition from medieval to modern times coincided with the triumph of the idea that man could be what he wished to be in this world. The notion of man as his own sculpture thrilled Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a Renaissance humanist thinker. God let man choose his appearance and gifts to enrich his life, making him worthy of all admiration. For Mirandola, the Adam, who can choose between crawling on the earth like an animal and becoming a philosopher, or even a more exalted spirit surrounded by human flesh, is nothing short of a miracle. The ability of man to determine his erratic, fluctuating, and diverse nature is the cornerstone of his dignity. Kant's philosophical life search centered on the question, what can I know? Guiding him to the conclusion that contingent existence is impossible to overcome. The inexplicable empirical character of a fact can't be outdone by thinking. We just accept it as it is. An attempt at enwrapping the wholeness of the world in a thinking effort can only lead to the antinomy of reason. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, man can't help thinking about what interests him most: God, freedom, the immortal soul. For Kant, these ideas constitute a limit impossible to reach, the ultimate purpose of our striving. They show us the endless path of a self-improvement man takes in search of the divine within. So, like Mirandola and Kant, my friend Caranti too refuses to accept the banal coincidence of human existence.
Contingency of human existence, you mean?
Contingency of human existence, that's what I mean. His quest for the philosophical fundamentals of human rights will lead him to the notion of dignity. In Caranti's eyes, Dignity is the ability to suppress all interests, the incentives of sensory experience, natural impulses, and even the strongest instincts of self-preservation, only to act in accordance with one's own perception of duty. Caranti's discourse of human rights is inspired by Kant, but not Kant's own. As Caranti said, it's Kantian. It's not Kant's. The term of duty, as defined by Caranti, doesn't necessarily arise from the overly strict and rigid categorical imperative, but rather some version of a moral code. One may believe in God, accepting the biblical commandments as his own and abiding by them. What matters, however, is the awareness of calling, whatever the calling may mean in the life of an individual. The ability of man to act in accordance with duty is the substance of dignity. It's also why human beings are worthy of respect. The link between Caranti, Mirandola, and Kant is the faith that there is a hidden purpose, steering man to the point where it's possible to reconcile the particular and general freedom and necessity. Philosophers aside, artists and great novelists too share this feeling of human purpose. It took the collapse of the medieval conception that the sinful state of human nature was a result of the first transgression for a shift from epos to the novel to happen. The man, living by the word of the church in the hope of redeeming himself and deserving a place in heaven, was replaced by Mirandola's chameleon, with animalistic and divine potentials inside. Only the new chameleonesque man could become the protagonist. Writers as Luigi and writers of the great novels are not interested in conventional types, yielding to small town rules out of habit, fear, or indifferent dullness, whose predictable lives are made conditional on empirical learning. The artistic genius carries the spiritual archetype inside, along with the subjective feeling of purpose to shape the empirical facts against. The integral experience of the world is impossible to reach by research, theory, or thinking. As Kant makes it clear in his critique on the power of judgment, only artists have an innate capacity to use their talent on an individual, particular basis to give birth to the principle of the development of the wholeness of nature rests on. What may be out of academic research, an artistic genius can achieve. The talent of an artist encapsulates the world in its entirety to fit our imagination, and the work of art lies at the point where freedom and necessity, the subjective and the general experience of the world meet. But now, not just any writer could have wandered into this story inspired by Caranti's notion of dignity, but only a giant of a world literature to match Kant's philosophical genius, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. One of his masterful novels was Resurrection, a tale of Prince Dmitry Nekhlyudov lazily crawling out of bed to wash his face in his luxurious bathroom. With a blurry look of boredom on his face, he puts on his superbly tailored clothes, throwing a resentful glance at a letter by a rich countess trying to make him propose. His spirit exhausted by life devoid of meaning, his mind oblivious to the joys of a beautiful spring day, the prince is going out to serve on the jury at a trial of a prostitute who was stabbed to death by a violent client. The face of the blaze, the spirited nobleman, is eloquent of the soul-shattering realization that the unfortunate woman was his aunt's young maid he had seduced and abandoned before he joined the army. He made the poor Maslova girl pregnant, but the baby she left after birth died and things went horribly wrong for her. She ended up in a bordel where local bullies molested her until she couldn't take it anymore and killed one of them. Her sad fate penetrated through the layers of selfishness, egoism and lethargy and indolence of Nekhludov's soul. And beginning to see something good inside himself, he decides to help Maslova, increasingly aware of a light still flickering within. Spending a fortune on her lawyers, he is doing everything to get her out of prison, and Maslova's contempt for him can't keep him from following her into exile in Siberia, to be there for her, cure her, and protect her. And it's under inhuman prison conditions, away from society and its trivial rules, that Nekhludov manages to reach the divine inside. And now, in a word, Mirandova, Kant, Caranti, and Tolstoy trust the human ability to make a moral decision. There are different ways in which they are trying to prove what can't be proven or be the subject of empirical research. What matters most for my thesis, however, is that the four have come to completely different conclusions as to the conditions surrounding the quest for human freedom. The society Tolstoy is familiar with, that of trivial conventions, hypocrisy and boredom, buries the divine light given to a man at birth. Nekhludov materializes his dignity on the train to Siberia, surrounded by the prisoners convicted of the most horrific crimes. Is it at all possible for the people who have buried the light within and who, unlike children, birds and bugs, are unable to feel the beauty of the spring day, to try sentence and send to prison each other by their own laws without causing a greater revolt? Only after he was fatally wounded did Tolstoy's Andrei Bolkonsky learn to appreciate the beauty of the world. Pierre Bezukhov, another character in War and Peace, barefoot and hungry, finds the wisdom he has been looking for while watching a simple, kind peasant Platon Karataev in prison. Now, contrary to Tolstoy's belief, Kant and Caranti argue that it takes organized civil society for moral progress to happen. At the beginning, there are only republican institutions to harness the devastating passions of individuals. Yet, for such institutions to be created, no moral transformation of people is required. The institutions pitting the selfish wishes, interests, and views of individuals against each other, thus preventing them from taking the place of common good, would fit a nation of devils just as well. But unlike America's founding fathers, who believed there is no way to eradicate human selfishness and egoism, Kant and Caranti presuppose the possibility of moral self-improvement within a society. A bad person establishes a state to become a model citizen afterwards. Indeed, human selfishness and egoism might be necessary to create conditions for the sublime and beautiful someday. Yet, Caranti's interpretation of Kant suggests that in civil society, the individuals gradually perfect their aspirations. The republican tenets of justness are progressively migrating from institutions into the people's hearts and minds. The people are learning how to distance themselves from their own interests and look at the problem through the eyes of another. Just like freedom, Kant's republic is only an idea to endlessly aspire to, but never to achieve completely. A man's life is too short for him to reach all potentials. The seeds nature shows inside a man can only yield at the end of a historic path. Kant sketched in his essay the idea of a universal history with endless purpose. trying to unearth a natural purpose in the meaningless course of human reality. Hannah Arendt, for example, detects an ironic tone in Kant's political papers, though describing the most famous one, Perpetual Peace, as reverie, quoting the author himself. Arendt maintains that Kant realized the importance of the political as opposed to the social much too late. It took the French and American revolutions to wake him up, which is why his political papers shouldn't be taken very seriously either. Caranti disagrees. Having managed to clean up the dogmatic layers from the Kantian vision of the development of human history, he insists in his book that Kant's vision is based on knowledge of human nature and experience of the world. Moreover, Caranti is persuading us that there are tendencies in today's world to indicate that history is more likely to move forward than to stagnate or regress. And now, can we believe him? Can we believe Caranti? Is there good evidence to support the argument? Caranti's book has revealed the mistake, for example, the democratic peace theorists made when they undertook to find empirical proof of Kant's thesis that democracies do not make war on another. In a bit of a gauge, the degree of the progress human history has made, they always miss something. Instead of offering objective scientific insights in their papers, they simply arbitrarily give in to the ruling ideology and the interests of the most powerful state with imperial ambitions. Yet it's fair to say that our time is not easy on those planning to examine the empirical understandings of Kant's vision of the progress of mankind. This refers to Caranti as well, who tends to accept the development of international organizations and verbal commitment to democracy and human rights across the world as irrefutable empirical evidence of his thesis. Ours is a time of illusions, however. On the outside, the omnipresence of liberal democracies is hard to deny. But liberal democratic institutions are universally devoid of their fundamental philosophical and historical meaning. The basic tenet of the French revolutionaries, that the power is inherent in the will of the people, is all but forgotten in today's Europe. At first glance, it might seem that the European Union provides a proof that democracy guarantees perpetual peace between states. Quite the contrary. Peace in today's Europe is the result of a process that actually keeps democracy in check, neutralizing its power and making it inconsequential. Peace, human rights, and European and national institutions of representative democracy notwithstanding, it's not the Republican principles that are embedded in the souls and minds of citizens, but the numb indolence instead. Peace in Europe that has trampled on the Republican principle for the sake of welfare and safety is as silent as graveyard, as Kant would say. Now, detecting the misconceptions of contemporary social researchers trying to unveil empirical evidence of historical progress cannot resolve the underlying dilemma of my paper. Can you achieve a dignity within a society or by running away from it? Who's right? Kant and Caranti or Tolstoy? Are the hopes for historical progress and the moral improvement of men and social institutions justified? Are social researchers up to a quest for answers? Based on what Kant wrote in his critique of the power of judgment, I would say no. Whoever might want to offer scientific proof of the improvement of social conditions for the development of human potentials would have to address historical experience in its entirety. This, in turn, would lead them right to a labyrinth of causes and consequences from which they would never think their way out. So the wholeness of experience is scientifically unfeasible, Kant has convinced me. I suggest, therefore, that we should follow Kant's writings about reconciling aesthetic and teleology, seeking the answer in works of art. More precisely, let's explore the great novelist and who wrote about Kant's theme, putting on paper what their own time and society had whispered in their ear. The writer is not looking for evidence, impartial objectivity. Artist's feeling is a me, I feeling, where the universal feeling of the world and life lies too. Apparently, the artistic feel of the world always tells us the same. Society can't stand the individual refusing to comply with its banal conventions, starting as an autonomous search for dignity and meaning instead. Exile, misfortune, and tragic death are their punishments. It was the fate of Socrates, which Hegel called justified. The middle-class mentality would drive to ruin those challenging its conventions, views, and system of values, only to defend its uneventful order. Euripides' Hippolyte, Molière's Misanthrope, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and the unfortunate Prince Mishkin in Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot, all shared the horrid experience of exile. German experience, for maybe, is vital in supporting the thesis that mankind improves by learning from the unspeakable horrors of war. In the teen drama, Günter Grass writes about a boy who does not want to grow up into an adult world of war atrocities. And then after him, Heinrich Bell leaves his clown at a railway station with a bottle of liquor at the side, hiding from a hypocritical society of adults arising from ruins of war together with democratic institutions. And then, today, Peter Handke is a lone wanderer rambling the gloomy streets of today's world society in search of that sparkle in the eyes of a man with the potential for beauty and the divine, which Mirandola, Kant, and Caranti pinned their hopes on. It was but by sheer coincidence that Handke had found it in the eyes of a girl reading a book on the bus, or in the gaze of a boy with a ball standing in the middle of a devastated cemetery in Kosovo. Now, to be honest, I don't see the same trends of historic progress in today's world Caranti does, but I'm not rejecting his understanding of the moral politician either. As much as accepting the idea of a republic and establishing the state of perpetual peace is a necessity, the moral politician can accelerate, that's what you showed, can accelerate the process leading to the ultimate goal. His mission is to manipulate the facts of the empirical world very prudently and astutely, adjusting them to the universal law of justness. For that, however, there isn't a pattern to follow or a set of rules to implement in reality. Politics cannot be condensed into science. The skill of a politician cannot be learned. A world in which politics is possible is not a closed, predictable world of pre-effects to be put together by the rules of scientific observation. Politics, just like art, requires not only a rare talent, but imagination and creativity as well. It's easier to find a good man than a good politician, Caranti recalls. Arguing, that the talent alone is not enough, and that a politician also needs knowledge, and now, Caranti says, the best social science can provide. I'm curious, however, if social science might misguide. I will wrap up with an illustration, an example. At the height of the European sovereign debt crisis, two important thinkers published books that attracted serious public attention each. One a philosopher, the other a novelist. Jürgen Habermas and Michel Houellebecq, respectively. Habermas believes that the systemic crisis that suspended democracy undermining the old way of life in the south of Europe, is only a necessary step towards a republican European constitution and eventually a prelude to the Kantian ideal of a universal civil society. Houellebecq, on the other hand, writes about a French literature professor completely lost without the benchmarks of the profession, nation, religion, family provided for European in the past. Horrified at this freedom of a child left alone in a crib, the professor, unwilling to sacrifice his own comfort, eventually yields to a new worldview the Islam was presenting. The question is whom the moral politician described by Kant and Caranti can trust. Is it Habermas, offering not only a philosophical excuse for Europe's this small reality, but also a soothing advice? All goes according to plan. Everything is as it should be. What is needed are some modest reforms limited in scope. Or is it Houellebecq, waking him up, screaming to warn him at the historical step backwards? The title, "The little autonomy and dignity the Europeans have won in their national states since the French Revolution, is gone. And if you don't want Europe to slide into dark despotism, something big has to change. In a quick, radical social sweep, perhaps," the French author suggests. I know whom to trust, but it doesn't matter because I'm not a politician. So that's my presentation.
Thank you, Bob. Just a short question. At the beginning of your text, you mentioned innate capacities of genius, and you connected it with some kind of algeklaerte soeverein, enlightened sovereign, who should protect human rights. Did I understand you correctly?
No. I did not mention enlightened sovereign.
Some kind of Hütte der Verfassung towards them,
no? The way I see it, the question of Hütte der Verfassung is the crucial question for today's world. But maybe I had it somewhere in my mind when I was writing this paper. But I do not point explicitly to this important theme that we deserve gratitude to Carl Schmitt for making it so.
It would be very controversial.
No.
Okay, thank you. Can I have a big Thank you. Please.
Well, Bojan, thank you very much. I really don't know what to say, in the sense that your contribution was so rich, and I am really delighted that it inspired you so many different references, that my book was sort of inspiring all this. And when I say I don't know what to reply, I mean I don't know whether I should. Well, let's see what I can do. Okay. You start with this big idea that you have, that basically philosophers do not like contingency, and that they look for, solid, unchangeable grounds, and in this sense, this attempt that I propose of establishing human dignity as a feature, a constant, stable feature of human beings being connected to capacities that they have, is just one example of this tendency that philosophers have. Now, I guess that the first point I want to make is slightly pedantic. You seem to take Pico's, Kant's, and my account of dignity as pretty much identical. If you don't, it's I make the point just for the sake of clarity, even if it's not directed to you. I mean, I think that Pico's makes the point that we are worthy creatures because we are radically free. We are shapeless creatures, unlike animals that have a an objective purpose, an objective shape, an objective place in the universe, whereas humans are so strange that they are so radically free that they can do whatever they want with themselves. I think Pico uses this metaphor of the freedom of degrading themselves toward the beast or elevating themselves toward the gods. This is not exactly the same notion that I read in Kant, because I don't think that Kant says that we are worthy creatures because we are radically free, because radical freedom in itself is morally neutral. If anything, is a presupposition of morality, but it's not what morality is.
And could be dangerous too.
And it could be obviously dangerous. You could decide to go towards the beast. I think that Kant says that we are worthy creatures because we have a capacity for a certain specific kind of action that is autonomous. So it's not so much our ability to go up or down, it's our ability to go up. Ability, I mean, it's not necessary that we are move from potentiality to realization of this ability, but the sheer possession of this ability is the ground of our dignity. So that was just a pedantic point in the history of philosophy. But when going back to your point of our aversion toward contingency. Yeah, I guess if you mean by that we are after something that can operate as a point of orientation in our normative thinking, yes, I agree with you. The only thing, perhaps that's another pedantic point. At one point, you said, on the one hand, Kant needs this notion of dignity, but being linked to the notion of autonomy, he also tells us that we cannot have a proof of our autonomy. Therefore, on the one hand, he invites us to put all our bets on this notion, but at the same time, he tells us that we cannot be certain that we really are autonomous. I guess that's also the beauty of Kant's philosophy in a sense, in the sense that he certainly denies that we can have a scientific proof of the fact that we are autonomous. I agree with that. On the other hand, you don't want to make this point as fully groundless, and you don't want to put it at the same level of an article of faith, because at one point you seem to suggest that ultimately we are left with the option of either accepting as an article of faith that we are autonomous or rejecting it, as you do with a religion, basically. It doesn't matter the reasons, you have to believe it, either you believe it or you don't believe it. Well, it's not exactly like that in Kant's system, because of course you have this, in the Critique of Practical Reasons, you have this argument related to the fact of reason, and as Kant calls it, in which he gives you a sort of proof, not from theoretical knowledge, but from the practical point of view, as he puts it, that we are autonomous. Ultimately, the intuition there is that we discover our autonomy all the time we feel the obligatory force of duty, and we realize that despite the fact that doing something would be ruinous for our interest, we still feel that we have an obligation to do it. It doesn't matter whether we then act on duty or not, or we give in to inclinations. What is important is that it's a common experience for every human being to hear this call from duty, if you want. Use this notion of calling and so on and so forth. So that is the closest thing that we have to a proof of our autonomy. It's not a proof in the sense that it's not a scientific experiment, it's not a fact, but it's a fact of reason, as Kant puts it. But this immediate consciousness of being subject to a normativity that has nothing to do with your sensuous inclinations, with your interests, and so on and so forth, is something more than an article of faith. So, okay. So that was the second pedantic point I wanted to make. Now, the other point I want to make, this is certainly less pedantic, is about what you said on the different conditions that Kant and I, on the one hand, and Tolstoy, on the other hand, describe for moral improvement. Okay. So Tolstoy seemed to say, unless that guy went to Siberia and made his life considerably worse than it used to be when he was, surrounded by pleasure and so on, he could not discover the divine in himself. Whereas Kant and I are suggesting that the moral improvement of human beings happens only in a society, and in particular in a just society, in a republican society. I think that you are conflating two levels here. There is a general level in which basically Kant's idea is that we, independently of the social conditions in which we live, there is a basic level in which we cannot be fully deaf to the call of duty, to use your metaphor. Kant had this idea that the moral law is immediate in every consciousness, independently of the condition in which he or she lives. So this notion of autonomy is immune to the different social conditions in which human beings find themselves. Then there is the question of how you make your potential for being a moral person, not in reality, not a potentially moral person, but someone who acts most of the time in accordance with duty, it's not from duty. Then the question of what kind of social conditions you are in becomes relevant. So Kant's idea is that basically a republic living within just institution makes your moral life easier than it would be if you were to live in an unjust social setting, unjust institutional setting. So, I mean, the basic idea is that if you live in a disordered societies, I mean, it's a point that I was making this morning with Marcello. If you live in a society in which there is no rule of law, in which people fuck themselves all the time, steal, I mean, they do not follow some basic moral rules, being moral in that kind of social setting is extremely hard. You still can, Kant says, because it's not the case that your autonomy is even touched by the injustice of the environment in which you live, but certainly, being a moral person in that kind of condition is difficult. So, in the same way in which Kant sometimes says you need to go and visit hospital to see people who are in pain in order to make your compassion stronger. I mean, all this is not, of course, it's not suggesting that you need to have certain moral feelings in you, because these feelings are going to lead you to the moral action. But he's saying that certainly you don't want to develop cynicism, egoism, and so on, because then being a moral person, even if you are still capable of being as such, is going to be more difficult. So I don't know if I was able to distinguish clearly the two levels of on the most basic level, we remain autonomous independently of the kind of society we live in. at a more specific level, we need to have the right conditions in order to make our moral life easier. And if we live in a just society, as you were mentioning, Kant is explicit about that, the justice of the institution sooner or later will translate into the justice of the individuals and the moral improvement of the individuals who live within that society. This is a point Kant takes from Aristotle, and you find it identical in his writings. It's important for the moral improvement of people that they live within a just social context. So I don't think that at the first level that I distinguish there is any difference between Kant, Tolstoy, and myself on this notion of institutional facilitating conditions for morality. Now, at one point you were mentioning my criticism of the democratic peace. I think that you are not fully faithful to the spirit through which I make my criticism of the democratic peace. I'm not saying that I don't believe in the fact that democracies don't fight each other. First, I never said that. In fact, I think it's a fairly solid social law. First, I don't think it's just a question of hegemony. I mean, democracies don't fight each other simply because, as long as they were facing the Soviet Union, they had to wing with one another because there was a common enemy. So of course they were not fighting each other because, and I certainly don't think that institutions and the intrinsic quality of those institutions have nothing to do with this fairly surprising outcome that seldom, if ever, democracies fight each other. So I'm not criticizing the democratic peace for this. I am criticizing the explanation, if you want, of this fact that you find in democratic peace, that, to begin with, focus mainly on internal character of domestic regimes in order to explain this outcome, and doesn't give enough importance to the other two pillars of the Kantian model that have to do with international right and with cosmopolitan right. I guess that the main criticism I have against the explanation that the democratic peace gives of the fact of the democratic peace has to do with the idea that what creates a peaceful attitude, at least towards similar regimes, is not so much the democratic character of the regime, but is the republican, the amount of republicanism that is within each internal regime. And by republicanism, I mean what Kant means by republicanism. So something that is not exhausted by a certain institutional organization, so separation of powers, the general will being the ultimate ruler, and so on and so forth, but also a regime in which citizens have been socialized long enough within the justice of the institution so that they have certain moral responses towards war, towards the idea of using national power in order to oppress other peoples, and so on and so forth. So I think that this piece of the lesson that Kant gives on how to reach perpetual peace has been completely missed by democratic peace theorists. But I'd like to signal to you that I am trying to improve democratic peace theory. I'm not saying democratic peace theory is just the rhetoric of the hegemonic power, and it's all bullshit because ultimately there was no war simply because, as the realists say, there was a common enemy, or it's something along
But
these
you
lines.
said there was a war between American states, 1861, 1865.
I'm saying, yeah.
So you just find arguments, empirical arguments against this theory.
Yeah,
That's what I was pointing to.
No, I agree. Well, I'm trying to say that the regularity is not exceptionless as Michael Doyle wants us to believe, but I'm not saying that it's still not significant. I never said it's not statistically significant in 200 years, if ever there were few democratic conflicts. So, there are people, Spiro, your colleagues, social scientists, who try to make exactly this point, that from a statistical point of view, the lack of war between democracies is insignificant. Because there were too few in the 19th century, because they were too distant at one point, because there was a common enemy for 50 years, the Soviet Union, and therefore the fact that they never fought each other is statistically insignificant. There are other people who say that it's not really democracy, it's capitalism that makes peace. So there is this crazy guy called Gatzke, who makes the point in favor of the capitalist peace, so the idea that ultimately is the free market, the fact that there is free exchange among states, that the only true factor in favor of peace has nothing to do with the quality of the internal regimes and so on and so forth. So there is a lot out there, but I don't share any of these critical views. The last probably thing I want to say is about the moral politician. The second last, because then I want to say something about Habermas and Oldenbeck, of course. Okay, the moral politician. Yeah, you read it right when you quoted the passage in which I say that there is an interesting parallelism between the moral politician skills and reflective judgment. So, famously, judgment, actually both determinate and reflective, is a faculty for Kant that cannot be taught.
That's why it takes genius to.
Okay, yes. So I agree with the spirit of this suggestion, but I don't want to take it too far, in the sense of the following. I think that Kant describes the moral politician as someone who needs to have some intuitions that about what to do, because reality is so complex that you don't go to school to make good political decisions. There is no professor that is going to tell you, if you are in this situation, then take this decision. If you are in this other situation, take this other decision. It's not like learning a technical skill. But perhaps the point I wanted to emphasize most is that this intuitive ability that cannot be done without is to rest on a lot of empirical knowledge, availability of the best social sciences and so on. The moral politician is really a hero. As you rightly reminded, I think that Kant is suggesting that it's much easier to be a moral person than to be a good politician, because the good politician needs to be in command, be on top of very complex systems, human societies, know what is morally right to do, know that sometimes what is moral has to be delayed, because going after what is morally mandatory could be disastrous and could make your effort similar to that of the moral fanatic. Needs to know how society works to the best of the knowledge that is available. So it's really an heroic effort to be someone who knows the best science that is available, knows what morality requires in each situation, knows how to modulate what morality requires in order not to become a fanatic, have a look at the consequences of the action, whereas the moral person, up to a certain extent, is free to be worried, if I'm going to act from duty, what is going to happen? Maybe there will be bad consequences for people. You can be a moral person and not pay attention to what morality may cause to the life of other people, and so on and so forth. So I guess that I was simply suggesting that the life of the moral politician is very, very difficult, and it takes the best minds available in order to grasp this amount of complexity and have this amount of prudence. That's all I wanted to clarify about my account of the moral politician, read, of course, in Kant. Now, you seem to be more Hollenbeck than Habermas. You seem to suggest that you seem to be suggesting two things. One, which is linked to your skepticism about democratic peace program, is that the peace in Europe, has nothing to do with the fact that we're talking about a federation that is made of democracies, that it is a federation between these democracies, among these democracies, and that there is a lot of cultural and economic exchange among these countries. If the social condition, the economic condition had to change, if, for example, Islam were to become the dominant ideology due to immigration in France, and perhaps economic regression would make extremely appealing the money that comes from Arab countries, then we would be in trouble, and all this wonderful rhetoric about the stability of peace, our commitment to human rights, our commitment to pluralism, and so on and so forth would be gone. I think that you may be tempted to read into this notion of the guarantee of perpetual peace that any improvement that we may have made in history is not reversible. That is clearly a wrong conclusion that you don't want to draw from either my book, which is not important, from Kant, that is more important. But I would say that it is extremely fascinating, the fact that a continent that has hosted, I'm going to say something very banal, but that was the center of war. That has been the home of the worst wars ever experienced by mankind, in a couple of decades will make 100 years of absolute absence of war. To say that the internal features of the European Union have nothing to do with this quite surprising result seems to me quite difficult to make a convincing argument out of that. And also, if we talk about perceptions, who would really believe that there is any chance right now of a new war between France and Germany, or between Germany and the Netherlands? I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm saying that the three factors that Kant thought were relevant and that are pretty much all present now in the European Union are a rather strong guarantee that there won't be war soon, at least, between these countries. When you were mentioning, what reasons do we have to believe that human affairs are improving, well, I mean, we have reasons to believe that if we follow certain political directions and we stick to the plan, to the original plan that Kant depicted, results are out there, and they are quite astonishing. I think that the European Union, I mean, going back to the discussion we had yesterday, is clearly the best realization of the model that Kant had in mind. And I think that it's very hard to construe a realist argument in which peace within Europe, at least, is fully independent of the domestic factor. They are all liberal democracies. The international factors, they are part of a federation that mediates conflicts and is there to facilitate, on the one hand, the kind of interdependence that there is among nations, and act as mediators of conflicting decisions that may come. And third and cosmopolitan factor, the amount of interchange, interdependence, both at the economic level and at the cultural level. So the Erasmus program, I mean, the thing that come immediately to mind, the fact that we are now way more European than we used to be 50 years ago. So what reasons do we have to believe in progress? Well, there is reason to the extent that we take the model seriously. Perhaps that's the last point I want to make in reply to you. I mean, I wasn't suggesting that the idea that Kant is proposing is to say, well, let's do a thorough and complete historical analysis and let's see whether we can read a tendency towards progress in human affairs or, actually the opposite conclusion. I was suggesting that Kant has this rather speculative argument in which he says, okay, what are usually the causes of war? The causes of war are the attempt of a people to improve its economic conditions at the expenses of another people, by aggression, by exploitation of different sorts. Basically, it's the idea of making your life better at the expenses of someone else. And Kant says, if humans are given understanding, if they can learn, and they can learn because they have understanding, they have the opportunity to understand that the things that they are after through war, exploitation, oppression, aggression, and so on and so forth, these very same things can be obtained in a different way, through trade, within just institution, through peaceful and legal means. You can obtain pretty much the same things that you thought war was necessary for. Hence, there is no reason to believe that that individuals endowed with understanding will keep choosing war as a way of getting things that they can get in a peaceful manner. So it's a rather speculative argument, but I think that's the underlying argument that Kant has to believe in progress. Now, sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes, there are cases of collective example of stupidity. Irrationality, like Hobbes would say, is a piece of human nature. Therefore, sometimes passions, make you blind to your best interest. So even if it would be in your interest to, do something like entering a federation or, making the life of your country better, you refuse for a question of passion, for a question of national pride or what have you. But, this deviant behavior is bound to be removed from history, more or less, and therefore, irrationality exists, but it's short-lived, because in the end, people are bound to see what their best interest is. So,
Thank you, Luigi. You want, please?
No, I wanted to answer. There are many points that Luigi mentioned, and I wanted to clarify and to disagree. Of course, we always disagree.
Yeah.
That's what makes it interesting when we talk. So, first of all, what I wanted to tell you is that I read your book, but in my own way. I read in it what I wanted to read in. That's what Marx once said. I won't let books read me. I will read them. So, and that's my first point. And now to go step by step. First, Pico della Mirandola. I know that you are only inspired by his theory and by Kant's theory, and I think that he too thinks that what is to be admired in a man is potentiality for good.
Mm-hmm. You think that Pico thinks that?
I think that's how I understand him. Mm-hmm. Potentiality to do something that can bring you to the divine heights. Mm-hmm. But of course, this can be interpreted in many different ways. Now, when it comes to this conflation between different levels, I realize it, to understand Kant, it's in this political philosophy, it's very difficult, of course. But what I wanted to say is that how I understand Kant and how I understand your reading of Kant is that there is an ideal of republic, not something that is achieved. Mm-hmm. And when you say just society, organized society, republic, I think that Kant is not talking about something that has already been achieved, but about something that is to be achieved in the future. That has to do with what my colleagues were talking previously. In Kant's republic, ideal republic, once it is achieved, there will be only active citizens. So, for example, if I want to make a radical example, I would say that today Kant would say that none of us should be allowed to vote. If in his time these were only women and workers, dependent workers, I would say that today they're only passive citizens. He would say this.
Why?
Because we are all dependent in a way that he was talking about women and other workers, and we are not in a position to make an autonomous decision when we go to the elections. But I will come to how I justify this. And then, if we talk about Tolstoy and Kant, what Tolstoy tells us, he tells us about the society that he knows. He doesn't talk about society that could be made one day. Mm-hmm. He doesn't talk about republic that could be made. He talks about society that he knows that the only thing that he as an artist can do, and the truth about man and society is taken from this concrete historical, social, political experience that he was facing at his time. So that's, of course, Kant. When Kant talks about man, there are three different models. First, man is a part of human race that is progressing slowly. Then man is an autonomous being that can make a moral decision. And third, man is a part of society, and man which is not autonomous, the man in plural, as Hannah Arendt demonstrated. There are many nuances, of course, you're right, that I have to take care of when developing this argument. So when it comes to the democratic peace theory, I know that you are not completely against it, but what I want to say only is that you figured out that there are some empirical counterfacts to what they are trying to show us. Mm-hmm. And that was enough for my argument. And when it comes to this was a misunderstanding. I didn't want to say that Kant said us that we can't prove that men are autonomous beings. I know the example. If a ruler asks from his servant to give a false testimony against his friend,
It's an innocent man.
yeah, then he might do it or he might refuse to do it. But what is important, that's a fact of reason, that he knows what should be done. And as I said, Kant and Tolstoy come to this conclusion in a different ways. But what is important for me, that's what I learned from his critique on the power of judgment. It is related to the question, how can we assess whether history is progressing and whether social scientists are up to the task of assessing. And the conclusion that I drew from him is that artists who, as Welbeck, as Handke, as Heinrich Bell or Dostoevsky, are more up to the task than social scientists who always misunderstand or fail to understand or fail to see the relation between consequences and causes, etc., etc. That's what I wanted to say on that.
But the artists disagree about whether we are progressing or not. So they might be better equipped, but they give us conflicting reports.
He doesn't. I think that in the critique of the power of judgment, what he says, the way artists sees the world is completely subjective. It's I feeling. But within this I feeling, there is a general sense of the world and man, and there is. That's why artist is a genius, that he can transfer to us this feeling. And once we see a movie, once we read a book, we only feel that that's true. And
we feel that it's beautiful, not that it's true.
That it is beautiful. Okay,
it's different.
No. Okay, we feel that it's beautiful, but Kant says it's beautiful because within an artist there is a sense of purpose. He feels a sense of purpose, and that's by following this sense of purpose. That's the way he manipulates facts, empirical facts of the world, and the way he combines them is a world which is not a world of science, a world of facts, but from how I understand Kant, it's a world that is very close to the truth in a different way. And so now, when it comes to the peace, as I understand Kant, and for example, as Ingeborg Maus understands Kant, she says it's not only peace what matters to Kant, but republic.
Yes.
And it is very hard to say what's more important for him, republic or peace, what comes first and what follows.
Cassirer said that too. Ernst Cassirer said that too.
Hans Cassirer too, yes. And when you insist, then in Europe we have peace, there are no big chances that France and Germany will go to war. I can agree. But within this peace, established in this way, I think there is no republic. So what you and Kant are suggesting that the history is progressing.
So France and Germany are not republic.
No. If you, I think.
I mean, not even in a comparative way. I mean, given the standard, the ideal that is never achievable, you will agree with me that Germany is closer to the standard than North Korea or Iran or Russia.
That's a radical example. But if you ask me whether France is closer to republic today than it was 30 or 40 years ago,
that's different.
Or whether Germany is closer to the republic today than it was 30 years old during the Weimar Republic. It is, in my opinion, there is no republic. There is only passive indifference of disinterested citizens, which are all passive citizens. And Kant would say, even though it looks like it's republic because there are institutions of representative government, it doesn't have anything to do with what I think of republic. And that's why writers like Welbeck, he shows us it's not republican.
I wouldn't hold back to go to Gran if he likes it more than France, and then see what is the difference.
But Kant would say, let them in Iran choose their way toward.
No, that's not what Kant would say.
I think. Okay, just I'm finishing.
We have to make a short pause.
I'm finishing in just a second. Now, when it comes to war, if I want to make even more radical argument, Kant would say, for example, there are always these controversies and contradictions. For example, he says, Kant, no people has right to rebel or to a revolution. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, he says, as a spectator from the outside, disinterested spectator, I say that the event of the French Revolution inspires me and awakes in me beautiful feelings, which makes me think that history has purpose.
Yes.
The same goes with war. On the one hand, as a spectator, he will say, as an actor, war is never something that one should accept, or politicians have to do everything against war. But on the other hand, as a spectator, he would say war can also be something, can bring something in human nature that is to be admired, for example, courage or sacrifice.
Well, but it's not the same thing, right?
No, the spectator and actor. He clearly
true.
divides between these 2 points. So if he looks at today's Europe from a point of view of spectator, if we compare what he says when he looked at the French Revolution, he would say, there is nothing that inspires me in this piece of Europe today.
Oh well. Okay. Let's make a short pause, 10 minutes pause to drink a little bit of coffee because we are a little bit tired. I made a mistake. Alexander Fatic, I forgot that he has another meeting at 2:45, so we won't hear his commentary, unfortunately, but we will find.
We cut him out. Poor guy.
Okay, 10 minutes. Short break. Which I think you slightly underestimate in your book, and that is that Kant basically assumes everything that he argues for. He says, okay, I will develop an ethics which is based on the qualities of human beings, and de facto qualities of human beings are this and that, and they're not. So I think that's a large part of the point of the critique, don't you think? Okay, great. Thanks, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent comments, all of them. Let me go in the order you mentioned. Well, I mean, it seems that the main theme you have is a strong skepticism of autonomy, at least as Kant conceives of it, and as I also conceive of it, because I don't think that Kant and I, on this point, are very distant. So it's really the reality of autonomy that seems to accompany most of your comments. So, in addition to a general philosophical skepticism against this strong notion of autonomy as detached from our inclinations, you also add the point that neuroscience seems to have proven that Kant was wrong, basically. Okay, so you say that it's a fact that we are given values, probably from the community we live in, or from the family or the other things beyond us. That's exactly. I would tell you what you told to Kant. I mean, that's the point that we need to prove, right? Perhaps I can start replying by saying that Kant would be quite okay with the idea that certain values are given to us by our society, community, family. I don't think he needs to deny the phenomenon of socialization in general. What he needs to deny is the fact that sometimes when there is a conflict between these values and the moral law as it is immediately given to the human consciousness, according to him, then the human being is kind of determined or destined to follow blindly the values that were given to him by the society. So let's try to make an example. You are raised within a society that attributes a lot of importance to national solidarity. I mean, citizens first, co-citizens have to have more rights than strangers or people who do not belong to your community. And then you are faced with a case in which, I don't know, you are called to testimony against a citizen, fellow citizen, because he has done something wrong to a foreigner, and you have a conflict between the value of being a friend of your fellow citizen on the one hand, and what Kant says, sort of universal code that tells you that you shouldn't give false testimony against this foreigner simply because he's a foreigner, and the guy you are supposed to testify against is a fellow citizen. Now, Kant would say two things. To begin with, no matter what values you were given, in this case, you feel that there is a problem. You feel a moral issue there. And that's more than enough for my purposes, that you don't say, oh, it's perfectly okay to give false testimony against someone simply because he's not a fellow citizen. I think Kant says, no, nobody would say that. Number one. Number two, that you know that you should not give false testimony against the foreigner, and independently of what you do, this phenomenon or feeling this obligation is what shows that the normativity you are under is not exhausted by the values that you are given by the society. So I guess it's really up to us to believe this story or not. I mean, if you believe that human beings are fully programmed by values, or more decisively, if you believe that this phenomenon of being faced before contrast between certain norms that benefit you or that you are accustomed to or that comes from your traditions on one end, and a more general universal norm that says basically you cannot apply principles selectively or in an inconsistent way. You cannot treat this guy in this way mainly because you would not that he applied that principle to you or something like that. I mean, of course, the Gondel rule is not the same thing as the categorical imperative and so on and so forth. If you believe the story, I think you cannot be as certain as you seem to be that autonomy is just a phantom of the brain. That it's just a big illusion. Again, there is no scientific proof of autonomy, but it is an experience that we often have of a contrast between a very general rule that has to do with consistency within our moral life on the one end, and interests, inclinations, values that come from other sources. As long as there is this conflict, there is hope that we are autonomous in this strong sense. I don't recall now what neuroscientists say. Honestly, I don't know enough, so I'm not going to comment on that. The second point you made was about the possibility that if Kant had an Indian life, he would have been less obsessed with autonomy. Well, again, I don't think that Kant was completely unaware of the fact that there are different moral sensibilities around the world, and that we can differ also substantially on specific values depending on the culture or the moral tradition we belong to. What he would probably deny is that there is no element of universality in our moral lives independently of these cultures we live in. So there could be a layer in which we are all equal in our moral outlook, which is compatible with the possibility of differences in organizing lower level values depending on the cultures we belong to. That's the first point. The second point is whether really, as it's usually assumed, the value of individual autonomy, the idea of looking at people as worthy creatures in virtue of the fact that you see them as intrinsically autonomous. So the value of individual autonomy as being restricted to the West or to a certain, if not a part of the West, I don't know, Protestant ethics or something like that. I try to show in the book that even in moral traditions far away from Protestant ethics or Western civilization in general, it's very hard to make sense of certain substantial part of this tradition without assuming a commitment to individual autonomy. Of course, two things. One, you have to interpret this different moral tradition in a certain way, but I think it's enough to show that it's possible to interpret them in that way, in order to show a compatibility between them and the value of individual autonomy. And two, I never suggested that the value of individual autonomy is the only one that counts in these other traditions. But I think I take myself as being entitled to show merely that there is a reasonable interpretation of these traditions in which individual autonomy plays some role in the universe of values. So if that is the case, then grounding human rights on individual autonomy is not as parochial as many people think. So that's that. It's a very short paragraph in which I try to show that Hinduism, Buddhism, and the Muslim culture are committed to this value of individual autonomy with three sub-values that come with it. Of course, it's way too short, is just an attempt, but it's a start. At least that's how I consider it. Now, the point about sentimentalism. I think that your point here is that, Kant may have realized that the life of someone like Olga, who does what is right and enjoys doing what is right, is not necessarily less noble than this hero that wants to commit adultery, that wants to eat too much, but he doesn't do it. He suffers a lot, but he stays on the path of duty, and therefore is. So having considered that to Kant, I think that your main worry is that he doesn't realize that we really don't move unless we have some emotion that pushes us somewhere. Now, that's a very interesting point, because I think that Kant would subscribe the sentence that I have just made. So he makes the point that you have to have an account of the principium executionis of every action. The principium executionis means to give an account of the motivation by which he means the sensuous motivation that leads you to any action, including the moral action. So what would be the sensuous inclination that is behind a moral action? Well, that's the infamous doctrine of pure interest. So Kant thinks that your sensibility is touched when you are faced with a moral problem. If you decide to act on duty, you do it because you are motivated by a sense of elevation that you anticipate in your being able to do what is obligatory, to do what is right in that situation. So that's the pure interest that we have for the moral law. So if all that sentimentalism says is that there is no way of making sense of explaining human actions unless you presuppose some sensuous motivation behind each of them, including moral life, Kant would agree, I think. I'm not saying that everybody reads it this way, but that's the way I read Kant. And the doctrine of the pure interest is there to prove this point.
Feeling of respect is more explicit than this, and actually introduce it, especially because of this question.
Sorry.
Feeling of respect is actually...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, if sentimentalism says something more than that all that our inclinations, motivations, sensuous drives, and so on and so forth come from a need, come from the lack of something in our life for which we have no control. If sentimentalism, to put it in a Kantian terminology, says that practical reason can never be pure, that pure reason can never be practical, that is, that the moral law is unable to generate an emotional drive by itself, then that's not Kant. That's what Kant needs to deny. So I don't know whether you want to go for the strong version of sentimentalism, but the weak version, you and Kant, I think, agree.
Can I just jump in very briefly? Look at the version of sentimentalism by Michael Slot. His is what you would probably call a weak version, because he says basically his sentimentalism is based on the introduction of a specific value which grounds both deontic and consequentialist ethical considerations. He says, my general thesis is that all actions which are compatible with or arise from empathy for others are morally justified.
Are moral?
Are morally justified. Mm-hmm. Now, this can serve as a deontic principle, and it can also serve as a consequentialist criterion for the judgment of actions, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what would Kant say about that?
But they could be morally justified, but I think we are forgetting what is autonomy for Kant. It's act according to the moral law, to the categorical imperatives. That's autonomy. I mean, Kant connects autonomy with moral law and categorical imperatives. So the question of values for him has no value.
But Luigi doesn't say that.
No, I don't think so.
Something different, right?
I think that Kant wants a higher tribunal on these values. That is, if you want, the categorical imperative. That doesn't mean it doesn't give any significance to moral values per se.
But that they are heterogeneous to the moral law, according to Kant. I mean, according to the critic, the practitioner of philosophy, yeah. And to the
going back to his question, what would Kant say to the idea that all action generated by empathy towards the others are justified? He would say, well, empathy can lead you in many different directions. I mean, you can be sympathetic to the goals of Nazi Germany and or to emphasize with the suffering of someone who is brought to jail because he deserved jail. He has done something very bad. So what do? Are you saying that it's moral try to, let this guy escape because he's now suffering, and then you are in sympathy with his suffering? So morality cannot be exhausted by empathy, and there must be something that is independent of the kind of emotional reactions you have toward the suffering of other human beings, because otherwise you get in serious troubles. So again, but it seems to me that what you want to say with this example of empathy is again the point of sentimentalism that says you have to give me an account of the emotional side of the decision that leads you to a moral action. I don't know if.
I think Sloat wants to achieve a situation where you can have several morally justified courses of action.
It's different.
Yeah, several. There's no one right course of action. Mm-hmm. So if I sympathize with a Nazi war criminal who was brought to jail,
right,
I also sympathize with his victims. I sympathize with everyone who deserves sympathy. Now, this may, if I'm the person I am, this may lead me, if I'm on a jury.
Yeah.
This may lead me to advocate or to vote for a more lenient sentence, because I generally don't believe that people should be sentenced harshly, and or it may lead me to advocate for a harsher sentence because I sympathize more with the victims.
Right.
But I can provide a moral justification of my actions if they are based on what Sloat calls care ethics. If they're based on a genuine care for other people. So that is methodologically very different from Kant. And I just wonder, I don't have an answer to this, but how Kant, you know better, how Kant would be position himself?
Well, of course, Kant would say empathy is fine as long as it's not the only criterion for that guides you in your moral life, because you need some higher criterion that tells you how to order these empathetic or sympathetic responses to different peoples. I mean, empathy. I mean, what if you are in a tribunal and you only see the war criminal, the Nazi war criminal, and you don't have access to the suffering of the victims or the family members of the victims? I mean, to orient yourself in your moral decisions there based only on the sentiments that are reason in your soul, given the particular situations you're in, is it seems to me as a tricky business. So I guess that's what Kant would say.
Okay, thank you, Luigi. Okay, Igor. Please.
Thank you for teaching to read your book. I have one small short suggestion and two brief questions. First, I want to say that intuitively and plausibly I agree with most of your thesis, but I will try to look more Kantian on it to see if there are some problem or in using some Kantian arguments or Kant arguments and applying it to your thesis and something like that, and try to make discussion probably interesting. First, I want just a small suggestion. One of professor in our faculty in Belgrade, Jovan Babić, wrote a text, Golden Rule and Categorical Imperative.
Babić was the reason of my first visit to Belgrade.
Yes.
Give my greetings to him.
Okay, do you know the text?
I know.
Oh, okay, then I will don't dwell on it. Okay. When you introduce autonomy and dignity, I think I'm a little more interested in position of looking at the feeling of respect, and think it's important in a way not only proceeding from dignity, but at least being our way of how we are aware of it, first of all, and then how we have respect to the other person. But if you look for this position, one thing is important for the content of respect is primarily the moral law, not any moral law, but one only possible universal moral law. And through this, I would say, focal commitment, commitment, where our focus in on moral law, we became to feel dignified, and in the same way aware and have a respect for the other persons. But it is only through the moment that our focus and commitment is on moral law. So when I look what your argument about autonomy go, in some way the content, this type of content focus, the moral law, is let's say considered as not so much important. What is this content? But your focus is on agency itself, on capacity to act in this way, which looks fine, but shift could look fine, but the problem, both empirical and philosophical, I think, will be, okay, if we could say from Kantian position that respect came into play only when we have as its content the moral law, then it is a problem of intersubjective or universal relation between others. I respect, because moral law is universal, and Kant claimed that everyone is conscious when making practical judgments have awareness of moral law, then I easily apply to all others and I have respect for the others. But if my content is my moral law, let's say I follow the golden rule, and Olga's content and his content are different moral laws, it is in a question, would I give to them respect in the same way as their moral laws are different? That is one question. And of course there is a second question. Probably we should simply not look about the content as a moral law, or moral laws, anyone, but look just at the agency, what you try to do. And then of course the problem, I think Rasko also started, and in some way Sale, that agency by Kant, or autonomous agency, is only one explanation of it, actually, because
it's only one explanation.
In a sense, there is only one possibility of autonomous agency, because all other determining grounds of our action, except the acting in accordance to one and only moral law, because it is only one determining ground that is actually cleared from empirical reason and universal. It's only possible explanation of autonomous agency as free. And Kant would be probably today in line with merely narrow services if you look at this position. Okay, all of our explanation of action could be explained as empirically determinate and not autonomous, but only one, and this is most important, is when we act according to the categorical imperative, and that's the only case. So I think there are two philosophical problems here. One is, if we leave this basis of Kant categorical imperative, which is totally clean from empirical. I have not ever seen any other suggestion for the moral law that is in this way clean from empirical. Golden rule certainly is not. Can we make a really good philosophical argument about autonomy? And the second, how we make it, because one important part of Kant's argument is that all other persons have this immediate awareness only if they have a reason, they will have awareness of obligatory power or categorical imperative, but if there is not universal rule, but all have the other, could we make this intersubjective relational? I would think, is Olga a reasonable person? Does she apply Haskell or not? And Kant, I think, in addition, Kant made very good, or at least good enough for his time, philosophical arguments why we presuppose this in all other people. And my second question would be, I would try to be very brief, but when I look at your very good argument for politic in Kant have to be in some way independent from rights and ethics as a different, as a specific question, and that's very good, I think, topic to start. But I think it would be a very good addition to it that the question of society, which is very important, kind of both in rights, both in Religion innerhalb der Grenze der reinen Vernunft, there is always the direct arguments that have to lead to the society and societal acting, as Boyan also tried to introduce in the discussion, but also the question of public. Practically in all his texts, he speaking about public, the Hannah Arendt insisted on public thinking important for politics, but we also know that Kant faith in a progress in some way always related to public. He doesn't think that individual politician will make them good, but only public will educate itself, and so on. So I think it probably a little less important in your end of the book, the question of society and the public, and not only a question of individual political actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the last question, but I'll try. So to the first question, which I think is very good. On the one hand, you like the fact that I try to distinguish between the moral law on the one hand and the categorical imperative on the other hand, if you want. Yes, as you said, I defend a sort of deontology without the categorical imperative, as I call it. That is the idea. The phenomenon that interests me is the human ability to act on principles, to follow rules that are independent of their own egoistic interest. I think that's what the most stable layer of human dignity has to do with this capacity. Now, what is the problem with this position that is compatible with many different moral laws? Because, of course, the golden rule is already quite problematic, but it's close enough to the categorical imperative, because, of course, it's not the same thing. You can, want to do to others things that you would be ready to do to you, but these things are clearly wrong. Think about the mob ethics. It's okay to use violence to get rid of your enemies. I will use violence to get rid of my enemies, and I'm perfectly okay with the idea that my enemies use violence against me to get rid of me. So it's perfect reciprocity, but you wouldn't say that mob ethics is moral. So, but think about even harder cases. I make the example of the Nazi officials in Berlin that stay faithful to Hitler. They do not surrender. They die. They are pretty. They act on principles, except that these principles are the principles of Nazism. So what do you do? Well, in the book, I try to suggest that there must be limits to the kind of principle that you endorse and that you follow independently of your personal interest. That I don't set these limits very clearly, but I just suggest that it's not the case that anything goes as long as you act independently of your personal interest. I have to say that right now I am no longer certain that I need this qualification, and I think I am prepared to say that it's reasonable to admire the Nazi official who decided to die for consistency with his ideology, fidelity to his ideology, because we are admiring him for this act of courage that is perfectly compatible with not admiring him for the way more serious things that he has done that have to do with the content of this principle that he wanted to be faithful with. So I don't think, ultimately, I really don't think I need to set limits to the kind of principles that you may be faithful to and that you want to remain faithful to independently of your personal interests. So this answer or tries to answer this question, because what you're saying is that if the moral laws are different in each of us,
from Kant, you could make this Kantian position, I think, because for respect it is important that it is respect for moral law, and not for your position, but
for Kant.
I think for Kant, if you think that moral law is different to the other people, he will say, okay, that will destroy in some way our possibilities to respect if the situation was so bad. Or he didn't think that.
Yeah, I think that the Kantian story is that you respect the ability in you and in others to follow the moral law. So the ground of respect of yourself and other people is the fact that they are all capable of following the moral law and to act from duty. Now, I agree with you that the moral law that Kant has in mind is one moral law. Well, I agree. I have my doubts. But let's assume that you're right, is that the categorical imperative is not just, a meta rule that makes room for possibility of different specification of the content of the moral law. But let's assume that it's not a meta rule; it's the rule with its own content. It has the same function of the golden rule. So that's what Kant says. You respect the ability to follow the moral law, and the moral law has to be one for everybody. What I'm saying is that you respect people for the ability to follow a moral law, and it's not so important the content of that moral law.
What are my problems? My problem is one empirical, just short, because what's happened, why we do not respect others, we do not respect, someone will not respect others, that's what empirically happening now, philosophically, because he thinks that he's probably not a reasonable person. I think that Indians are not reasonable person because they don't have moral laws as here in Europe. That is empirical problem. But on philosophical level, I think that if you skip out and go into the philosophical level is the problem to explain how we get to universality of agency and how we get philosophical understanding of autonomy in that way. I think from Kantian perspective, if we want to be strict, it is very problematic because Kant actually thinks that only action that is free is action where the determined ground is just universal form of the law.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the empirical level, I agree with you that there may be cases in which, even if we respect other people for their ability to follow their moral law, we might have stronger reason to disrespect them because of what we think is lack of reasonableness and so on and so forth. Well, to that I would respond that what I am trying to do with this linkage between human dignity and this ability to follow the moral law is to establish a sort of last resort basis for avoiding atrocity against other individuals. So even if you really dislike other people because of their ideas, because of what they have done and so forth, my intuition is that you can still remember that these people are capable of something extremely worthy, which is their ability to set aside their personal interest, and that should be enough for not going beyond a certain threshold of the respect that you may have for them. So it should be enough not to be cruel towards them. It's perfectly compatible with stopping them, putting them in jail. Working against their ideology, the case of the Nazi official. All this is fully compatible, but you cannot you cannot make actions that are incompatible with that intuition that these people are still exceptional in their ability to act from duty. independently of the content of duty. Okay, so that's the empirical level. It's actually also the philosophical level. I mean, I'm saying that there is room for not linking too rigidly the grounds for respect of yourself or other human beings and the universality of the content of the moral law. So what remains universal there is this phenomenon of being under a normativity that doesn't give a shit about your interest. That's what is important for me. So this is universal. This is a feature that is universal and remains universal even in my account. What does not remain from Kant is the idea that a specific content of this moral law has to be only one specified by one of the formula of the categorical imperative. So I realize it is a huge detour.
Would you agree that whatever is this content, in order whatever is this,
yes,
that we call moral law, this principle, it has to be very pure in the sense that it is not something empirical, because it will be self-love and or inclination, and it will not sufficient your argument of moral capacity for agents.
It has to be pure, not exactly in the same sense in which Kant wants it pure. It has to be pure to the extent that it has to be independent of your personal needs, of your egoistic needs. Yes, in this sense. It doesn't have to be pure in the sense that it cannot be motivated by empathy, it cannot be motivated by commitment to a certain cause. So again, the picture I'm trying to defend is that of the human being as worthy of respect as someone who acts on principles that are fully detached, at least in his consciousness. Then it's always possible that we are not aware of selfish motives that are unconscious in our motivational account. But the picture I'm trying to defend is that you cannot do things that human rights say are not good to human beings, because these beings have this quite awesome feature of being able of setting their personal needs aside. I mean, it's not a very original idea. I realize it's something that it's part of common sense. But it must be part of common sense, because if you want to have a foundation of human rights, you cannot come up with a notion of human nature that is too distant from what major cultures think of the human beings, because you're not doing pure ethics, you're doing a theory of human rights. So even for political reasons, you don't want to be too distant from common sense, because you need to convince people that that's an account of the human being that they would buy.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So next one is Miloš.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Miloš Marković. I'm a PhD student at the University of Belgrade. I would like to say my thanks for an opportunity to take part in this seminar. And thank you for reading your book. It was quite interesting, and my comments will refer to the first part, so to the nature of human rights. I would introduce three distinctions and base my questions on them. First one will be the difference between state and international human rights. I mean, in reading your book again.
You said state and international.
Yes. So the explanation precedes. Reading your book, I come across the distinction between human rights and international human rights. But as a PhD student at the legal faculty, so as a jurist, I read it state as opposite to international, or national as opposite to international.
Okay.
So that is what bothers me, or pricks my ears or my eyes when I read it. So the question that arises here is, who creates rights actually? Is it the state, or is it some international community? Having in mind that human rights are introduced after approximately the Second World War with all the international conventions. State or international community, or furthermore, the more abstract question, do we create or do we state human rights? That is, do we invent or discover them? So create or invent would be by state or international community, but discovered would be by, let's say, philosophers. The second question would refer to the difference between, or this newly introduced distinction between moral and legal rights. And that is the topic that interests me most, since I think the line between the legal and the moral is blurred in your arguments. I mean, now I come to see that you make a distinction. I mean, Rastko broached the distinction between philosophical and international legal rights, but once more, when I hear international, I hear national, the other side, and now pure ethics and human rights theory. So I am a bit confused as a jurist. What do you actually understand under human rights theory, since we in jurisprudence talk both about moral rights and legal rights? And the question here, as opposite to who creates right, would be who fulfills rights or who bears duties. Do these human rights you are talking in your book about are towards the state, thus they would be legal, or are towards other people, thus they would be moral rights? State is bearer of duty, or other people, my companions, citizens, are bearers of duties. And related with that also the existence of sanctions or enforcements of these rights. You mentioned institutional organization, institutional response or enactment, so the existence of some documents where those human rights are stated. Is it necessary for the existence of right, and should we name it legal right? All the places in your book when you call upon international conventions, and that we ought to pay attention to them when discussing how are we going to infer or come to them from the statement of dignity or humanity as foundation of them all. But which rights? In my eyes, you always do refer to moral rights, but then you bring up the topic of international conventions, which are clearly legal rights. And the third distinction, so all three distinctions are connected, all the questions. So the first one, who creates rights, or do we create them or invent them? The second one, who bears duties? And the third one, who bears rights? The distinction between human and animal rights. I mean, I don't recall reading the exact term animal rights, but you do tend to attribute some human rights, or human rights to a certain extent, to animals as well, to mammals, to be more precise. That is your second distinction from Kant, if memory serves. So the first would be categorical imperative, is not the only one, so golden rule may be taken as well as the basics, or the basis of morality, moral norms, moral system.
And I already changed this point, as I said.
Okay, but the second one would be very interesting, that human beings are not the only subjects of human rights, but mammals as well. Why? Because of the foundation of human rights. Right. Thus, they are autonomous, although we now brought that into question as well. Okay, so what is interesting? I mean, I do incline to comply with the stance of Peter Singer and Bentham before him, that it is capacity for suffering and not capacity for reasoning or capacity for autonomous decision that makes for stands that animals are also entitled to some rights. Mammals, let's suppose that mammals have autonomy, but you claim to a lower degree. On the other side, it comes to my mind that dolphins have a more complex brain. If
Wolves.
Dolphins.
Dolphins.
Yeah. So should they have greater rights than human beings? Yes. So, on the other side, as referring to the term animal rights, I never heard of the term animal dignity. So, I don't recall that being written anywhere. And what I find problematic, aside from dolphins and animal dignity, is that the thing that animal cannot raise claims. So in jurisprudence, we seek to dissect, to analyze a right into three parts. So first is entitlement, second is duty, and the third one would be claim. So, and in my opinion, animals may be entitled. We may have duties toward them, but they are unable to have fully rights because they cannot raise claims. Yes, and you also explicitly said that autonomy does not gradate within human species, but what about the animal world? So, further questions? Further question.
So can you repeat the last question?
Yes. Autonomy does not gradate within human species. That is your claim you made today during discussions. I haven't read it, but I find it very interesting. If autonomy does not gradate within human species, does it gradate within the animal world? And what about differences between people themselves? Since it does not gradate, then we have to take into account the difference, for example, between a healthy individual and mentally deranged individual. What about the difference between a philosopher and a layman? Does a philosopher has greater autonomy since his horizon of action is broader, far broader? And that would be yes. And just to mention, as for the maybe it would induce some more interesting answer. In jurisprudence, we make a difference between two types of inquiries, de lege lata and de lege ferenda. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe not. De lege lata inquires what is the existing, the valid enacted law, while de lege ferenda tries to state what should be law or what is good law, what laws should the legislator enact. As for the distinction of philosophical and legal rights that I considered somewhat confusing, I would propose two distinctions between moral and legal rights and philosophical and empirical, or to say explanative and descriptive rights, or at least inquiries about rights. So, moral rights would be, as you following Kant argued, are innate, while legal rights are enacted, and philosophical inquiry about rights would explain rights, explain their basis, their foundation, while descriptive or empirical inquiry about rights would describe the existing ones. So that's the lists of rights. So the questions, just to make it sound more plausible. For example, moral, empirical question would be what human rights are. While philosophical question would be why human rights are innate or enacted, or why human rights should be enacted or should be innate.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Miloš. Can I have this? Thank you.
All right. First let me say that you people guys are very committed to feel good. I've never had a seminar that lasts 4 hours, but on the one hand I'm very grateful of this attention, but I have to say I'm coming close to the end of my energies. So anyway, okay.
I won't speak.
You will not? Okay. Okay, so the distinction that is important in the theory of human rights is not that between state human rights and international human rights. It's between human rights in general, which is basically mean natural human rights, and international human rights. So what is this distinction? This distinction is distinction between the human rights that philosophers may think, for good or bad reasons, that humans have independently of institutions, and the international human rights are simply the human rights that already exist, that are those established in the international treaties of 1966 and anticipated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, basically, or all those you find in the conventions on human rights. So this is a distinction we owe to a legal scholar that is called Alan Buchanan. He makes a lot out of this distinction because he complains that philosophers are focusing only on human rights in general, and they do not pay attention from a philosophical point of view to international human rights, that is, the human rights that already exist. I mean, for him, there are a lot of interesting philosophical questions you may raise about this second category. So, from this point of view, your first major question, do we create human rights or do we discover them? It depends which of the two categories you have in mind. That's why it's important to distinguish. Certainly, we create international human rights, and we discover human rights. I'm assuming that we discover anything, but we try to discover human rights in general. Okay, so that's the answer to your first question. Now, are moral or legal rights? Again, depends which of the two categories you have in mind. International human rights are clearly legal rights. Are legal because they are part of international treaties. So, to the extent in which you consider international law a piece of the legal body, then human rights are legal rights. Now, do they have a basis on moral rights or not? Well, here opinions differ. I mean, from my point of view, sure. What matters is the moral layer. Once you have established that we have these moral rights, in particular, if you follow Kant, these moral rights, innate rights to external freedom, then you can derive a set of constraints that are going to influence your legal rights, in the sense that you cannot introduce legal rights that violate the obligations that you have already established in moral rights. So it's a kind of constraints on how you can organize your own state. Okay?
But just ask for the question, who bears the duty?
Well, that was another question. Now, who bears the obligation to respect, well, which rights again? International human rights, primarily the obligation to respect international human rights, I would say, is on states or institutions, and only derivatively on private people, private individuals. Who bears the obligation to respect moral human rights, the human rights that philosophers usually focus on? At the institutions and individuals in the same way. So, if you violate my external freedom in the state of nature, Kant would say that you are violating my right pretty much in the same way in which an institution would be violating my innate right to external freedom. It doesn't make a difference there. Because these are rights that apply even in the state of nature. In the state of nature, by definition, there are no institutions. So if there are rights, who can be the duty bearers of these rights? Other individuals, the only other entity out there, obviously. So I guess Buchanan is right in making this distinction clear. When we talk about human rights, we always have to make clear whether we are referring to the human rights that are part of the treaties. These are legal rights. The obligations are on the shoulders of institutions primarily. They are created and not discovered, to use your language, and so on and so forth. If we talk about human rights as we usually talk about them, philosophers talk about them, it's a completely different story. Both in terms of who bears the obligation, whether we discover it or not, whether they're moral or legal, now the last point that you made, I'm afraid I didn't understand. I think you are saying that you are sympathetic with my idea of not assigning autonomy only to human beings. You think that it makes sense to think that even animals or higher mammals have a moral life to the extent in which, you know, they have a certain degree of autonomy. But I think, okay, that's probably what you're saying. Why do you focus on animals, and what do we do with mentally disabled people or children? I mean, the usual criticism of Kant's ethics. I mean, if they are not rational, either because they are not yet rational or because they lost their rationality because of sickness and so on and so forth, does that mean that they do not have human rights on the lights of your foundation? Well, to begin with, I mean, again, we want to distinguish the case of children. Well, I want to say three things. The case of children, I mean, the case of children is really a known problem in the sense that nobody thinks that children have to have the same rights that adults have. So I don't see why it should be a problem that children are not given the same human rights that adults have, because that's a distinction that we make all the time. We don't let children vote. We don't let children make certain decisions about their life that we think they are not able to do. So I think it's perfectly in line with common sense to say that we do not give the whole range of human rights to children precisely because they lack a certain amount of rationality. In the case of the mentally disabled people, it's a different story. It's more complicated. There is a lot of discussion about that, also from a Kantian perspective. Well, one thing that you may say is that what you respect in that case is the fact that this body that is in front of you that is no longer rational used to be rational, and basically it's a sort of symbolic thing to respect it in a certain way. But again, I think that nobody thinks that someone who has lost consciousness bears the same rights of a person who is in full control, is fully rational. I mean, even law usually recognizes that there are cases in which other people have to make decision for you in the case in which you lost your mind or something like that. So, but perhaps the most interesting thing that has to be said here is that from my perspective, from the perspective of the foundation that I've given, human rights are really not restricted to the human species, because it's not a case of speciesism, as Peter Singer says. Human rights are not speciesist, in my account at least. Because if they are grounded on this ability to follow the moral law, it is a mere coincidence that this ability to follow the moral law is usually to be found in human beings. But it is a fortunate consequence of my account that you are forced to recognize human rights to entities, even fictional entities, if you want. If they were to become, I mean, if you were to meet Superman, or if you were to meet Spider-Man, or someone who you conceive as capable of moral behavior in the same way in which you conceive of your friends or yourself, and so on and so on. From my account, you would say that even Spider-Man and Superman had human rights. So why is that interesting? Because it shows you that, at least on my theory, what you are defending is not a species against other species or discriminating against other species. You are defending or privileging, if you want, a set of entities in the world to the extent in which they carry this capacity for moral behavior. It really doesn't matter whether the boundaries are the boundaries of one species or it's constructed in another way. What matters is what they can do.
Sure.
So
the animals
can't
raise claims.
The raising claim. Well, I don't see why you think that is so important. The fact that they have the capacity for autonomy, but they cannot raise claim, from my moral sensitivity, is an extra reason for protecting them. Because they would be like human beings who are mute or are unable to express themselves, but still have the capacity for moral behavior. So it's an extra reason for caring for animals, not for taking rights away from them.
Maybe I'm looking for some universal term, like not only human rights.
Maybe just because I have a comment on this.
I'm sorry. I shall sacrifice my commentaries and questions because we are not only committed to conduct this seminar, but also committed to end it. So I think it's time. Okay. Never mind. I will find another opportunity. I want to thank first Luigi once again. Big thanks for your contribution, for your coming to our institute, and I want to thank participants.
And let's thank